Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this talk this afternoon. My name is Sarah Phillips. I am a professor of anthropology at Indiana University, Bloomington, where I am also the director of the Russian and East European Institute. And I'm delighted to share with you today some preliminary findings from my research on American cultural and literary diplomacy during the Cold War, Kurt Vonnegut in the USSR. And I'm really delighted to be able to speak about this work in this particular forum. And I would like to acknowledge that this is a speaker series, an area studies showcase, that is a collaboration between the 2018-2021 U.S. Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center grant recipients for Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. And thanks go especially to our colleague Zach Kelly at University of California, Berkeley's Institute of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. This Area Studies Showcase lecture series was Zach's brainchild. So Zach, many thanks for pulling us all together in these unprecedented times and giving all of the NRCs the opportunity to showcase our faculty and the wonderful research that they are doing. So kudos to you, Zach. I'd like to thank also the institutions that have supported this particular project that I have been working on for the last few years on Kurt Vonnegut in the Soviet Union. And many of those are institutions that are internal to Indiana University, Bloomington. I'll say a little bit about how this project came to be, but I'll just start out by thanking the Office of the Vice President for International Affairs, which actually has a faculty exchange program between IU Bloomington and the Higher School of Economics in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. And this has been a really fruitful exchange and a really wonderful way for faculty from all of those institutions to visit one another and get research done, and also get collaborations going with colleagues in Russia and the US. And I benefited from that exchange. Last year, I was able to spend a month in Russia doing research for this project. I also received research funds from the Hamilton Lugar School at Indiana University, Bloomington, which I'm very thankful for. I've also got some research funds from the College Arts and Humanities Institute for a future wing of the project that I will continue to work on. And finally, as I'll describe in just a moment, the seeds of this project were planted through an endeavor that I was part of with the Indiana University Arts and Humanities Council that was centered around Kurt Vonnegut and his relevance today. And I'll say a few more words about that in just a moment. So I'd like to begin also with sort of the usual caveats. This project, though I've been working on it for quite some time now, it's still very much a work in progress. It's gone in lots of unexpected directions. It's taken me into disciplines and disciplinary kind of methods and theoretical approaches that I didn't expect. And so in many ways, I actually have a pretty unusual scholarly background to be taking a project like this on. I'm not a specialist in literary studies. I'm not a specialist in translation studies. I am a cultural anthropologist. This was my first project ever attempting work in archives in the former Soviet Union. And I have to say that it has just been a blast. I found out that I really love working in archives. It's really rewarding. But I think that I also, as a specialist who's worked in the former Soviet Union for several decades now, and someone who brings an anthropological approach to questions of cultural translation, kind of the social lives of ideas, the social lives of works of art and literature, and even the social lives of objects, as I'll talk about more in this talk. I'm hopeful that I actually do bring something that is useful and possibly unique to the study of looking at how the work of this wonderful American writer has traveled to the Soviet Union. So, again, there are many directions that I could go. I really struggled in putting together this talk, in figuring out what exactly to focus on. And so I sort of took the path of least resistance, and I am giving a dabble here, a dabble there, and it's really kind of a potpourri of interesting things that I've found, fascinating stories that I've come across, and it's really a preview of the book that I am working on about Kurt Vonnegut's popularity in the Soviet Union. And so some of the ideas that I'm floating here are ones that I'm hoping to follow up in various book chapters. And so again, I'm very grateful for those of you who have taken an hour out of what I'm sure is a very busy week, a very busy day, and a very busy afternoon. And I so much welcome your input, your perspectives, your critiques, your questions. And I really look forward to developing this project and to getting feedback at this stage. So what I'm going to do, just kind of procedurally, I'm really going to talk for, I hope, about 40-45 minutes. And then I will take a look at chat questions that might have come through the chat, feedback that might have come through the chat, and kind of address that at the end. I wish I were agile and relaxed and comfortable enough to sort of do it all and field questions during the kind of body of the talk, but I'm afraid I'm pretty new at this, and I'm going to have to kind of break it up into the sort of more formal remarks and then the questions. So thank you for being patient with that process. Again, lots of sort of front information here, because I want to be able to be sure to acknowledge those scholars and those colleagues who have really supported this research, and who, some of whom have gone before me and really laid some really important groundwork. And I can't not mention the wonderful work of Yana Skorobogatov, who is now an assistant professor of Russian and Soviet history at Williams College. I was really inspired by Yana's master's thesis that she wrote on this very topic when she was a master's student at the University of Texas at Austin. It's a terrific work, and it gave me lots of background and ideas. And Yana, I'm so grateful for the work that you began on researching Kurt Vonnegut's legacy in the Soviet Union. Also, Julia Weingart at the University of Illinois, Chicago, has some very interesting work on Vonnegut in the Soviet Union. Michael Khmelnytsky wrote a very good dissertation comparing Vonnegut and Heller in Russian translation. That was for his PhD at the University of Calgary, that I have drawn on. Most especially, a huge amount of credit goes to a colleague who, unfortunately, I never had the pleasure to meet. He is no longer with us, but he was an IU PhD student in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures here, like I said, at IU. His name is Donald Feeney. And Professor Feeney had a terrifically fascinating life. But one of the sort of main foci of his passions, and he had many, many passions, but one of the foci was Kurt Vonnegut. And it was thanks to Donald Feeney that Vonnegut's work ended up in the hands of the preeminent translator, Rita Wright Kovalva, who also deserves a lot of credit for popularizing Vonnegut in the Soviet Union. So Donald Feeney had actually started working on a book about Kurt Vonnegut in the Soviet Union. He had published a few chapters in various edited volumes about Kurt Vonnegut and Rita Wright Covalva. And most importantly, for my purposes, Feeney kept up a very, very lively correspondence with both Kurt Vonnegut and his preeminent, like I said, literary translator, Rita Wright Covalva. And so those letters have been extremely valuable in this project. And have really led me into some fascinating areas. So without further ado, I'll start by giving just a brief summary of Kurt Vonnegut and kind of his life and work, with apologies that no kind of 2-paragraph summary is ever going to be sufficient for summing up Kurt Vonnegut's life and his work and what it means. But I just wanted to say a few words for those of you who might be tuning in who maybe don't know a lot about Kurt Vonnegut. So Vonnegut was born in 1922 in Indianapolis, and he died in 2007 in New York City. He was a graduate of Indianapolis's famed Shortridge High School. Vonnegut served in World War II as a very young man. I think when by the time the war was over, he was only like 22 years old. So he was a very young man. He was captured by the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge, and then he was interned in Dresden, where he survived the firebombing of Dresden by the Allied forces. And of course, this became the centerpiece of his most famous novel, Slaughterhouse 5. So named because Vonnegut and the character Billy Pilgrim, who was at the centerpiece of Slaughterhouse 5, the novel, waited out the bombing while they were in a slaughterhouse, Slaughterhouse 5. And very important for this story, Vonnegut was liberated during World War II by the Soviet Army. And that was something that was always very important for him and for his life story and for his relationship with the Soviet Union and Soviet readers. He had a very indirect path to becoming a writer. After the war, he enrolled through the GI Bill in the anthropology program at the University of Chicago, which at the time was basically a 5-year master's program. He didn't finish that degree at that time in anthropology, but instead he went to work at General Electric, where his brother had also worked as Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut worked as a publicist at GE. And that's when he started writing short stories and eventually, of course, switched his line of work, so to speak, to becoming a full-time writer. In terms of genre, Vonnegut's writing, it's wide-ranging. It's really difficult to classify. And to quote Donald Morse, Vonnegut's first 6 novels have been, quote, alternatively labeled science fiction, black humor, satire, schizophrenic fiction, fabulation, fantasy, and more besides. And Vonnegut has also been classified, and rightly so, I think, as a postmodern humanist. And here I'm drawing from the analysis of Todd Davis. Vonnegut articulated a postmodern critique of all grand narratives, particularly America's grand narratives, the corporate narrative, the narratives of technological and scientific progress, and the narratives of religious dogma. He stressed that while there is no existential truth, and pretty much all narratives are false, the narratives we tell ourselves do matter. So there's a famous line, of course, that's often quoted in Mother Night that says, "We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be." Vonnegut was extremely critical of American society, and he described the unraveling of the American dream. Vonnegut was embarrassed by the shameful practices of American culture and also by what he thought of as the lack of culture in America. He deplored the gaping disparities in wealth that capitalism unfettered produced and the exploitations of humans and human flesh. And so Vonnegut's novels are full of people whose bodies are being violated or have been violated or are somehow being exploited. Vonnegut hated anti-intellectualism and the dumbing down of the American public. And at the same time, he asked the big questions. He asked, what is the nature of the universe? Who or what controls the universe? What's the nature of human existence, and why are we here? But above all, his writing expressed a moral and ethical system based on humanism. And that's something that's really important for the story that I'm telling about Vonnegut and the Soviet Union and his relationship with Soviet readers. As far as style goes, Vonnegut has a very unique style. It's very identifiable. It's simple, it's wry, and he has a very unique authorial voice. And so a lot of people talk about reading Vonnegut, you feel like he's talking to you, or you feel like this is someone that you would be friends with if you had the opportunity to meet him. That's the kind of authorial voice that he has. So how did I get interested in this project? Well, I mentioned that there was an initiative through the Indiana University Arts and Humanities Council. And it was a self-described group of crackpot professors who got together to read Vonnegut's first 6 novels in order. And we were an interdisciplinary group. So there were professors who were from religious studies, anthropology, English, physics, other disciplines. And we did a sort of public-facing humanities blog about Vonnegut and his works from our own disciplinary perspectives. And so I'm very grateful to Ed Commentali at IU, who initiated this so-called Sala University, named, of course, after the lovable machine who takes center stage in Vonnegut's novel Sirens of Titan, Sala. So if you'd like to learn more about this, you can go to the website Sala, SALO.iu.edu for more on this project. And many of you probably know that Vonnegut is very much beloved in the state of Indiana. Like I said, he grew up in Indianapolis. We consider him our fellow Hoosier. Hoosiers play a role in several of his novels. For example, Cat's Cradle, when the idea of Hoosiers as a sort of concept, as a community comes up. So he's very beloved in the state of Indiana, and I would say particularly here at Indiana University. So I started reading Vonnegut's first 6 novels, and I actually happened to be in Ukraine when I was reading several of them. So I was going to conferences, doing some research, other research work in Ukraine. And I could not get over the fact that I'm sitting here on a train, for example, and the things that are swirling around me, the conversations about politics, about relationships, about society, were very, very much resonating with what Vonnegut had written about in the 60s, in the 70s. And it was very striking to me, and I wanted to learn more. And so this is the time that I stumbled upon Yana Skorobogatov's work that I mentioned, her wonderful master's thesis. And I also started to learn more about Donald Feeney and the role that he had played in this whole story. And I'll get to that in just a second as well. So I embarked on the project with some really general questions. I wanted to know, how was it that this quintessential American author with such a unique voice and style of writing became a favorite not only of Soviet readers who consumed Vonnegut voraciously, but also of Soviet literary critics and the Soviet establishment itself. And I wanted to know what work at the time, and the time period that I was really interested in was the 1970s. What work was Vonnegut doing in this particular period in the Soviet Union? What work was he doing for readers, and what work was he doing for the Soviet state? And To give you just a few words about the sources that I've used, like I mentioned, I have worked in archives. I worked in the Russian State Archives of Literature and Art, so-called Regali. I worked in the Kurt Vonnegut papers here at IU's Lilly Library. I worked in the Donald M. Feeney papers at the University of Louisville and at the IU Lilly Library. I also worked with the Rita Wright Kovalva correspondence. That is Vonnegut's main translator into Russian. And that correspondence is at the Columbia University Rare Book and Manuscript Library, the Bakhmetov Archive of Russian and East European Culture. My colleague Konstantin Azadovsky in St. Petersburg was kind enough to share with me his correspondence with Rita Wright Kovalva. And I also worked in the National Library of Russia, the so-called Publichka in Petersburg, and the Russian State Library, or the so-called Leningrad in Moscow. And I want to thank my colleagues who were so helpful to me as I was learning how to use the libraries, learning how to use the archives, especially Zhana Chernova in St. Petersburg, especially Tatiana Saburova at IU and Wook-Jin Chun at IU. Your assistance and your advice was just invaluable. As an anthropologist, I also wanted to conduct interviews. So I conducted interviews with literary and cultural figures in the USSR and Russia, with Vonnegut fans in Russia and in Ukraine, with publishers, and with friends and acquaintances of Rita Wright Kovalva, of Donald Feeney, and of Kurt Vonnegut himself. And so I was able to interview some people who had actually met Vonnegut when he traveled to the Soviet Union in 1974, to Moscow, and then again to Leningrad in 1977. And that was part of my project as well. I really wanted to kind of follow the breadcrumbs of Vonnegut's trips to Russia, to the Soviet Union, to see who he had met, what he had thought about his travels, and the readers that he met, the other authors that he met. So that's kind of another part of this project, is really following his travels. So a few teasers about my findings, and then I'll get into some other details. I found that Vonnegut's debut in the Soviet Union really hinged on the choices and the personalities of a few key people. And I've mentioned a few of these now: Donald Feeney and Rita Wright Kovalva. And it's actually kind of very Vonnegutian that these people were in the right place at the right time, and all of this kind of cascaded into Vonnegut getting translated, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Tracking the Soviet social life of Vonnegut has really helped to complexify the notion of the Cold War. I think when we think about the Cold War, we often think about it from the American perspective, and quite a bit of work has been done on the Cold War in America. But maybe there's more that we need to learn about the Cold War from Soviet perspectives, and thinking about Vonnegut and his popularity help us do that, how people read Vonnegut. Vonnegut's work was a tasty meal for both the Soviet state and for Soviet readers. But the state, and I include literary critics as part of sort of the state discourse, particularly during this time, the 1970s. So the state, including literary critics and regular readers, tasted Vonnegut differently. And it's also the very kind of Janus nature, the two-faced nature of his writing, the ambiguity, the satire, the gray areas in Vonnegut that make reading him fun and challenging, and that also allow for multiple interpretations. And so if you think about sort of certain political conditions, this can be very convenient, right? When you can privilege one reading of an author over another potentially alternative reading. And talking with people who were Vonnegut's readers in the Soviet Union really upsets any stereotype we might have about a stultified, bland society during the so-called period of stagnation. My research has really benefited from terrific studies of the thaw period in the Soviet Union, and I'm thinking in particular of Eleonore Gilbert, her book To See Paris and Die, and Denise Kozlov, The Readers of Novy Mir. But we've had fewer studies of kind of Soviet digestion perceptions of Western culture during stagnation. And what this project has really brought home to me is just the deep literocentrism of a great swath of the populace during the period of stagnation. How well read people were in the Soviet Union. And I would say a key finding of this project has been that a lot of, and this was known before, this is not my discovery, but we knew that a lot of readers who were particularly drawn to Vonnegut in the 1970s, 1980s Soviet Union were members of the so-called technical intelligentsia, right? So the kind of engineer class. And in some ways, that's not surprising. The subject matter that Vonnegut tackles, the fact that he is often read as a science fiction author. If you think about Player Piano, right, and how he's talking about sort of the mechanization of society, maybe this isn't that surprising. But what people that I interviewed really pointed out was that there was kind of a particular kind of member of the technical intelligentsia that was really drawn to Vonnegut. And those were people who were deeply interested in the humanities, deeply interested in literature, and very importantly, really deeply interested in social issues and in thinking about social problems. And so these were people who felt like they were kind of locked in to technical or scientific professions, but that didn't allow, because they weren't allowed to ask important questions about society, to critique, to engage in social critiques. Reading authors like Vonnegut allowed them to sublimate their interest in social issues. And I'll say a little bit more about this later, but I find this really fascinating. Another fascinating aspect, especially for an anthropologist, is that reading Vonnegut in the 1970s and the 1980s in the USSR was a thoroughly social experience. It was an interactive experience. It was a way to define oneself to oneself and also to others. And there were sort of entire social groups that formed around reading Vonnegut, loving Vonnegut, using Vonnegut-isms in daily conversation, and so on. So I want to delve a little deeper into some of these issues, but first I have a few kind of contextual questions that I want to address. Sort of trying to predict what questions might come up. So, how did Vonnegut's books get to the USSR? I don't want to be too flippant, but they got there on an airplane. So they traveled with Indiana University alum Donald Feeney, who I mentioned before. At the time, during, I think, what his first trip, well, mid-60s. So anyway, Feeney had been a middle school teacher in Louisville, Kentucky. And he became intrigued with the life and work of J.D. Salinger for reasons I won't go into. But he was also fascinated by Dostoevsky, communism, and the Soviet Union. And in 1961, Feeney decided he wanted to write a book about J.D. Salinger in the Soviet Union. And so he reached out to the woman who had translated Salinger to great acclaim in 1957. And her name was Rita Wright Kovalva. And that Rita Wright Kovalva was born in 1898. She translated many, many classics from the French, from the German, from the English. But translating Salinger's Catcher in the Rye in 1957 was a huge boom, right? It was a big splash in the Soviet literary world. So Feeney reached out to her for information about how Catcher in the Rye had been received. And they started this very lively correspondence. They became good friends. Feeney traveled to Moscow for the first time in 1966. By this time, he was a PhD student in Slavic here at IU. And then a few years later, so he continues corresponding with Rita Wright. And a few years later, he gave her copies of Cat's Cradle and Slaughterhouse 5. She was immediately smitten by the books. She was immediately smitten by Vonnegut, and she vowed to translate his work into Russian. And so thus sort of began the story of Vonnegut in the USSR. I'd like to give you sort of a rundown of what books were published when, just as a sort of timeline. Actually, Player Piano, Vonnegut's first novel, was translated in 1967, not by Rita Wright Kovalva. It was translated by Marat Brukhnev, and it was entitled Utopia 14, which had been a sort of alternative title for Player Piano in the US as well. This book, for whatever reason, went relatively unnoticed. It was not popular. People didn't read it, so it didn't make a splash. What made a splash were Rita Wright Kovalva's translations of Slaughterhouse 5 and Cat's Cradle, both of which came out in 1970. Slaughterhouse 5 was serialized in one of the so-called thick journals, the thick literary journals in the Soviet Union that were extremely popular and oftentimes impossible to obtain. Slaughterhouse 5 was serialized in Novy Mir, New World, and Cat's Cradle was actually first published in book form by the publishing house Molodaya Gvardia, or Young Guard. 1972, we see the translation and publication, again in these thick journals, of a few stories. The Foster Portfolio, Miss Temptation, Long Walk to Forever, and Thomas Edison's Shaggy Dog. Interestingly, 1973, Rita translates Happy Birthday, Wanda June, and she's hoping that the great theater director, Lyubimov, will stage Happy Birthday, Wanda June, but it's rejected. It's called a pacifist play, and Lyubimov can't stage it. It's unclear who made that decision. 1975, Breakfast of Champions is serialized across 2 issues of one of the most important thick journals, Inostranная literatura, so foreign literature. And, shockingly for many, 1976, an adaptation of Rita Wright Kovalva's translation of Slaughterhouse 5 is actually staged at the Soviet Army Theater in Moscow. An amazing event that, by the way, Julia Weingart at UIC is working on an analysis of the staging of The Wanderings of Billy Pilgrim, which was the title that was given this play based on Slaughterhouse 5. So then, 1978, we see a collected volume of 4 Vonnegut novels. That's it right here. Published by the Literaturная Gazeta, literary newspaper, literary gazette, publishing house. It's got a print run of 50,000 copies, disappears immediately from the shelves, and it was soon repeated with another print run of 50,000 copies. Then in 1981, there's a sort of a reissue of this volume, minus Breakfast of Champions, because Breakfast of Champions now fell under the International Copyright Convention. This reissue, though, does have the other 3 novels, and it has additional Kurt Vonnegut stories. This is published in 150,000 copies. This has got to be the greatest book cover I've ever seen. I love it so much. And I will say that people remember these book covers, right? They have a visceral memory and a reaction to thinking about Kurt Vonnegut in the edited volumes. They remember what they look like and what they felt like in the hands. Kurt and Rita developed a strong friendship, and much is made of this kind of in the literature. Much is made of the friendship between Vonnegut and his translator. She was a jealous translator in the best sense of the word. She was known as the best, most capable translator, not only of Vonnegut, but of many other foreign authors. And so I wanted to say a few words about some other authors and books that Rita Wright had translated from English, German, and French for Soviet publishing houses in the 1950s and 1960s. So here's a quick list. Dyson Carter, The Future is With Us, 1952. Graham Greene, The Quiet American, 1958. Sinclair Lewis, Babbitt, 1959. Mark Twain, Life on the Mississippi, 1960. The Diary of Anne Frank, 1960. Heinrich Boll, The Clown, that was a huge splash in the Soviet literary world, 1964. John Priestley, Sir Michael and Sir George, 1965. I mentioned J.D. Salinger, Catcher in the Rye and Other Stories. The original publication was 1957, then there was a reissue in 65, excuse me. Franz Kafka, The Process, 1965. Again, to be translating Kafka in the Soviet Union in the 1960s was pretty amazing. William Faulkner, The Town, 1965, and Soldier's Pay, 1966. And Nathalie Serrault, The Golden Fruits, 1969. So again, Rita Wright Kovalyova's career did not begin and did not end with Kurt Vonnegut. But he was a very, very, very important chapter in her career. So I wanted to talk a little bit about censorship of Vonnegut's works in the Soviet Union. And I'll really have to boil it down to the essentials here. There are already some terrific studies about literary translation in the Soviet Union. So I've relied on the insights of Maurice Friedberg, Lauren Layton, Mariana Tax-Cholden, Deming Brown, Carl and Ellen D. Proffer. Without kind of getting into too much granular detail, I think it's important to point out how important Rita Wright Kovalyova's approach to translation was for popularizing Vonnegut and for translating not only Vonnegut's words, but also Vonnegut's spirit for Soviet readers. So Wright was a practitioner extraordinaire of the approach to translation that was known as the free, artistic, or realistic approach, as opposed to the literal approach to translation. And for translators who are working under the pressures of censorship, taking up the artistic, realistic approach had numerous advantages because it gave translators and editors leeway to massage the text, to rephrase the text, and to in some ways, and in some cases, reinterpret original texts and bring them in line with correct ideology in a way that they knew would be amenable to the censors. And a lot of work has been done on what literary censorship looked like in the Soviet Union, who were the actors who were involved in censorship, what were kind of the stages of censorship. And certainly we do know that some translators took it upon themselves to self-censor their original translations with an eye towards actually getting this thing published and getting it through the other levels of censorship. And certainly Rita Wright did this at times. We can see, you know, where there's some documents that I found, some drafts with her notes, with editors' notes that show the different kind of stages of censorship. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a second. One fascinating thing about the books is if you think about the fact that Vonnegut's texts are so thoroughly infused with American culture, right? And this is particularly true for works like Breakfast of Champions. Rita Wright never came to the United States. There's some mistaken references out there to the fact that she did visit the U.S. She didn't. She was invited by Feeney and by Vonnegut, but she was never able to come to the U.S. She was not allowed to by the Soviet authorities. And so the fact that she was able to translate so much of the spirit of Vonnegut's work, and at times she did try to domesticate the quintessentially American objects, references, and experience, and change them into things that Soviet readers would be more familiar with. So, for example, a kind of silly example, but still an example, hamburgers become kotlety, right? Cutlets. Soccer becomes hockey. American football becomes soccer, and golf becomes hockey, right? In ways that domesticate the text and make it clearer for a Soviet reader. But like much literature of the time, really, what fell under the axe of censorship in Vonnegut were two things: the so-called political stuff and the sex, right? And so those, anything of a sexual nature, which included obscenities, which, you know, there's quite a lot of obscenities in some Vonnegut work. Anything considered vulgar or indecent was either eliminated altogether, or it was sort of softened or changed in ways that still got the point across, but that were not overtly vulgar. So I think I'll move now and talk really specifically about what Vonnegut meant for the Soviet state. To put it simply, Vonnegut, because of his anti-Vietnam War stance, because of the way that he talked about America being devoid of culture, or America being having a sort of perverted culture that revolved around consumerism and crass capitalism, and that had resulting in a kind of dumbing down of the American public. Because of all of these things, he was basically seen as a good anti-American American to foreground for the Soviet state. But there were other really specific things in Vonnegut that the Soviet state and Soviet literary critics drew out of his work. And I should say that in all of these translations, during this period of time, the 1970s, early 80s, there's always an essay, however short. It might be a few paragraphs, it might be several pages. There's always an essay by a literary critic that's informing the Soviet reader how they are to understand Vonnegut, right? And so it's drawing out pieces of the work and telling the reader how to interpret this. You know, what is the ideologically correct interpretation of Vonnegut? Now, whether or not readers ever read that stuff, you know, whether it was a foreword or an afterword, is unclear, but it was always there. And so this is where you see, if you analyze these literary criticisms, this is where you see the sort of official stance about Vonnegut and his work. Again, because he had been liberated by the Soviet army, because his life was saved by the Soviet army, and he was constantly pointing that out. He was constantly thanking the Soviet army. Vonnegut's first trip to Leningrad was actually in 1967, when he wanted to catch the celebrations, the Red Army celebrations of the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. That was his first trip that he took of his own initiative. So that was very pleasing to the authorities, that he was constantly talking about how grateful he was to the Red Army. Vonnegut was framed as a so-called fighter for peace. And this was a really important discourse during this time in the Soviet Union, right after the war. And I'm still trying to figure out how this discourse worked, because there were times when Vonnegut's allies in the Soviet Union, Rita, Wright, Covalva, Simonov, the great writer, was a friend of Vonnegut's, who he respected very much. There was a time when Vonnegut was being accused of being a pacifist, and this was absolutely unacceptable. No writer who was considered a pacifist was going to get through and get their work published in the Soviet Union. So Rita, Simonov, and others were having to argue for Vonnegut as a fighter for peace, not a pacifist, but a fighter for peace. And this was an important discourse that I'm trying to kind of follow in the discussions of the Union of Soviet Writers and Union of Soviet Translators. I mentioned Vonnegut's work focuses a lot on the ill effects of capitalism, which was perfect for the Soviet ideology. Also, he was very much beloved in the U.S. By youth during the civil rights movement. He was seen as a champion of youth protest and disaffection. This was something that the Soviet authorities found very convenient as well. And some of these are similar to the reasons that Soviet readers enjoyed Vonnegut. But like I said, my interviews with people who read Kurt Vonnegut voraciously in the Soviet Union show a kind of a different picture. And gosh, I wish I had I had more time for sort of the theoretical thinking behind this. But I'll just start by saying that I think it's important that Vonnegut hit the Soviet Union during the time of stagnation. I think kind of the thaw was a time when the Soviet people were reckoning with the past. And then we have de-Stalinization. We have people, really reckoning with what happened during Stalin's reign, during the war, during the purges. And by the time Vonnegut comes along, I really think that people, first of all, they're bored, as a lot of my my interviewees told me. We had to have hobbies, we had to have things to keep us busy. It was a very gray, kind of desolate existence during this time. But they were also eager about what comes next, right? They were eager about looking forward. To think about, what do we do now? We've reckoned, with the Stalinist past, and now we're looking ahead. And Vonnegut, with his kind of dystopian, interesting, hard to understand and hard to follow visions of the future. I mean, it was keeping people busy, right? I mean, it was interesting, and it was keeping people interested and sort of stimulating their minds to think differently. And like I mentioned, Vonnegut was asking those big questions, right? He was really asking those big questions about human existence. Why are we here? What is the meaning? What is the meaning of life? He also hit the Soviet Union in 1970, right? That's Slaughterhouse 5 and Cat's Cradle. right after the Prague Spring, right? So there had been this hope among, some communities in the Soviet Union that, something similar, some kind of opening, some kind of refresh could happen in the Soviet Union. And those fumes of hope, as some interviewees told me, they said we were living on the fumes of Prague Spring, still hopeful that something can change. And that's also a time that was important. And I've been looking at some of the work that looks at socialist escapes, right? What were those socialist escapes in this time of stagnation that that people sort of latched onto? Whether it was, travel or esoteric practices. I think reading was one form of socialist escape, and that's what some of the people that I interviewed definitely talked about. I talked about Vonnegut really appealing to the technical intelligentsia, right? And particularly a technical intelligentsia that was a well-rounded Soviet citizen, right? Highly educated, intellectual, very, very well-read, very interested in the humanities, and very interested in sociology, basically. And some of my interviewees told me, well, I went into physics, I became a physicist, but in another country, I would have become a sociologist. So that's the kind of person who really loved Vonnegut. Many fans of Vonnegut in the Soviet Union initially read him as a science fiction writer, just like many, readers in the US did too. And he came in, again, timing is everything. He came in on a wave of a revival of speculative fiction or science fiction, speculative fiction in the USSR in the 1960s. And then there was kind of a crackdown on speculative fiction in the early 1970s. So many Vonnegut fans were sci-fi fans who read him alongside Soviet speculative fiction and satirical writers, including the Strugatsky brothers, Ivan Efremov, Bulgakov, Fazil Iskander with the Godebecks constellation, and also Western sci-fi authors in translation like Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury. And of course, Vonnegut is always lined up beside Joseph Heller and his Catch-22. And in fact, some people confuse the two. They'll talk about Vonnegut and they'll actually be talking about Catch-22. So those were two authors that were very much read in tandem and which readers enjoyed together. So when Vonnegut's books came on the scene in 1970, there was very high interest in science fiction in the Soviet Union, but supply was getting low because of this crackdown that I talked about on speculative fiction. So although many interviewees said they started reading Vonnegut as a sci-fi writer, they stayed with him because of something else. And this, I'll quote one of my really, really helpful and most fascinating interviewees, Natalia Shulga from Kiev. And she said, it's not just science fiction, it's philosophy. It is fundamental questions about human beings, their presence on the planet, the society. And so Vonnegut helped people deal with moral and ethical debates in science, for example, right? If you think about Cat's Cradle and sort of the scientific ethics, questions about scientific ethics that book brings up. People really enjoyed Vonnegut's critique of ideology, right? I mean, this is something that Soviet citizens could understand very well, right? The dangers of wholesale ingesting a certain ideology. What are the possible consequences of that? Vonnegut employed techniques that were familiar to a Soviet readership. One of those that has been written about quite a bit, and Feeney wrote about this as well, is the technique of ustranение, which is estrangement or defamiliarizing something, which serves to make strange common objects and situations. So, of course, this is a technique that Leo Tolstoy used a lot. If you think about his description of an opera in War and Peace. And this was a way to make a social critique. It's also very anthropological, right? I mean, this is something anthropologists do all the time. They make the familiar strange, right? And this could be something that Vonnegut picked up in his, training at the University of Chicago. Who knows? But it's certainly something that appealed to Soviet readers. And it was also helpful to the translator, if you think about it, right? He's over-explaining what an object is, what a situation is, and that's helpful for a translator who's trying to digest this and translate it for an audience that's not familiar with the American context. Lots of things here I could say, but I need to sort of start wrapping it up and taking some of the questions. Vonnegut's humanism is something that is very much emphasized by people who read him in the Soviet Union and people who continue to read him today. People talk about how he saw the good in people. His heroes were all flawed, but they were lovable. Again, here's a wonderful quote from Natalia Shulga. And she says, his heroes look quite stupid. They are just like us. They are decent people trying to survive in an indecent world. And I think that really says it all. Vonnegut readers developed an affinity for his characters, and I think thinking about the kind of work that Vonnegut did in the Soviet Union, this is one of those really important things, that he helped Soviet readers see themselves in these thoroughly American characters. And I think that is some important work of cultural diplomacy that he was doing. Soviet readers felt that they could see themselves in these characters, and they felt they knew Vonnegut. They felt he was a very humane person. Beyond or in addition to this, Vonnegut was cool. And so I don't want to say that he was like part of sort of a counterculture movement or anything like that, but my interviewees definitely talked about how there were kind of communities of people, of friends, of readers who read Vonnegut. And it's easy to kind of appropriate aspects of Vonnegut, right? To take quotes from Vonnegut. He's eminently quotable. Take understandings from Vonnegut and then use those phrases, use those understandings, use those codes really in daily life and in conversation. And so people talked about being able to identify other Vonnegut lovers and other readers of Vonnegut by listening to this particular lexicon. And of course, a lot of this lexicon comes from Cat's Cradle in particular, when Vonnegut lays out this Bocanonism, this false religion with all kinds of terms and understandings. And this is really where this sort of Vonnegut lexicon is most crystallized, I think. And so a wonderful artifact of my research is something that an interviewee, Alexander Sungarov, who's a very prominent political scientist at HSC St. Petersburg, shared with me. It's the Book of Bocanon. So this is a book that Alexander and his friends in the 1970s, this is 1973, they put together. They went through and they compiled all the sayings of Bocanon from the Russian translations, all the vocabulary, karas, dupras, all of that, and put it in this wonderful, wonderful book. And this is just a terrific archive, terrific document that shows, right, the community of readers that could coalesce around Vonnegut. And that takes me to another example of the ways in which Vonnegut, some Soviet readers felt wonderfully empowered to become co-creators with Vonnegut. And so I ran across in the Lilly Library, this is a wonderful story that I could write an entire book about, but I ran across in the Lilly Library a set of drawings that a couple of young people growing up in Soviet Ukraine had done to illustrate Vonnegut's body of work. And it's, again, Natalia Shulga and her friend Alexander. And they made these wonderful drawings. I just wanted to show one example. This is from Slaughterhouse 5. This is when Billy Pilgrim was playing the organ. And these are just amazing, amazing drawings that are at the IU Lilly Library that Natalia actually mailed to Vonnegut, and she was able to meet him in New York many years later. And it's a wonderful story, but for me, it's a beautiful story of co-creation and how Vonnegut's work had such resonance and really had an afterlife with his readers. There's lots of stories about shortages of the books and how difficult it was to get a hold of the translations of Vonnegut in Russian. And again, as an anthropologist, this is really fascinating to me because it's a new view on what, you know, we all know about the consumer shortages that characterized certain periods in Soviet history. But when you think about the kinds of ties that people leveraged and built by acquiring, sharing, finagling, reproducing shortage items of literature that were in shortage, it's really fascinating. So you see how people would share, families would share subscriptions of these thick literary journals, for example, or people would do work. They would actually have sort of barter agreements with people that I'll do 10 hours of work for you if you'll let me borrow Cat's Cradle for 24 hours. So again, lots of stories about how hard the books were to get a hold of during this period, the 70s and the 80s, and the sort of social ties and networks that grew up around them. So much more that I wanted to talk about, but we're definitely at the end of the time here. Thanks to those of you who are able to stick around. And let's see, I think I'll leave it there. And I'm gonna go look at the wonderful chat comments now and see if there's anything I can track. Okay, so Theodora Dragostinova says, as a historian, I'm fascinated to see how an anthropologist uses cultural diplomacy as a framework. I have to go to a class, but okay, great. I would love to talk to you about that, Theodora. Yeah, I mean, right now I'm sort of thinking about it as what is the work that Vonnegut's texts are doing as people are interpreting them, incorporating them into their daily lives, and starting to think differently somehow about social ties, maybe about Soviet-American relations. A lot of my interviewees talked about how reading Vonnegut was a way to know America, and that it was very like people were very, very curious about America, about life in America, about American culture, American society. And so reading Vonnegut was a way to kind of dive into that. So that's, I'll be thinking more about that, Theodora. Thank you for that question. Yeah, that's interesting. Irina Gordieva about Soviet hippies regarded Vonnegut as a pacifist. I would love to learn more about that because I know his stance against the Vietnam War, for sure, was something that characterized him and how he was read and how he was accepted in the Soviet Union. I'm fascinated by this sort of um, distinction between pacifism and fighters for peace. I've found a few things written about that. I'm still kind of doing the work to find what's been written about this and kind of as discourses, what pacifism, why it was so so negative and somehow fighters for peace was okay. But there was a very concerted effort, I would say. And if I've looked at the archives of the Union of Translators at Regali, particularly for the 1950s, and this discourse of Borba za mir, fighters for peace, fighting for peace, is really strong in the arguments that translators are making for why a certain author should be allowed, right? They're a fighter for peace. They're a fighter for peace. It comes up over and over. So I'm going to be looking into that some more. Olga Filipova, hi Olga. Doing your research in archives or conducting interviews, did you find any signs or information about Soviet authorities have been making a decision to allow translation and publishing Vonnegut's books? That's such a great question, Olga. I haven't found a lot, unfortunately. Either I don't know how to properly search the Writers Union archives and the Translators Union archives, or they're just kind of spotty, but I have not been able to find a lot about how those decisions were made. I do know through looking at her letters and some archival material, but it's mostly looking at Rita Wright's letters to her friends and colleagues, that she took the initiative. Oftentimes she would translate like a few chapters from Vonnegut's book and then pitch it to an editor at one of these, thick journals, whether it was Иностранная литература or Литературная газета. Those were kind of the two big ones, or Новый мир. But she often took the initiative and worked very hard and pulled all, her networks to get permission to translate Vonnegut. And one thing that I really value is something that I found in Regali, which was one of her initial drafts of the translation of Breakfast of Champions. And you can really see the various points at which censorship is taking place. And it's kind of guesswork on my part, but I'm trying to literally look at, the color of the pen and whose handwriting it is. I mean, by this time I know Rita Wright's handwriting really well. So I can see where she is making corrections to her own draft. And then I can kind of see where an editor is coming behind and taking out all the parts that are too political, and there are very few of those. Mostly it's the sex. In Breakfast of Champions, it's mostly the sex that got axed. So thank you for that question, Olga. It's something I've been thinking about a lot too. Yeah, Olga, another great question. Was cultural diplomacy possible during the Soviet time without some common ground in ideological views? That's really a key question, and something that comes up in the interviews with readers and in, the sort of Soviet literary criticism, is how important it was to have this common theme of World War II. And so Vonnegut's very unique position of having been in Dresden, being bombed by his own side, right? Being bombed by the Allies, surviving that, telling that story in a really unusual way in Slaughterhouse 5, and then having the Red Army come liberate him and his fellow American soldiers is really key to the state's narrative about Vonnegut and who he was, that he's seen the horrors of war. You know, he knows how terrible war can be. But then they also always get in the fact that he survived attack by like his own side is really interesting. Readers talk about it differently. They talk about how, yeah, there was a lot of Soviet writing about World War II, right? There were even a lot of first-person kind of soldier narratives, but it had never been done the way that Vonnegut did it. And so his really unique voice was something that people talk a lot about. But they also talk about how he was completely non-sentimental about the war. There's no heroism in the way Vonnegut talks about World War II. War is terrible from start to finish. There's nothing redeeming about it. And so this was coming at a time in the Soviet Union when that Soviet myth of World War II was also being broken down. It was showing cracks. And people were starting to question the extreme sacrifices that the Soviet people were asked to make during the war. And I want to mention that I've been very influenced in this perspective by the historian Don Raleigh, who wrote he's written many wonderful books, but this one in particular where he describes the Soviet baby boomers. And this is precisely the generation that's reading Vonnegut in the 1970s, and how that Soviet myth culture, particularly around World War II, was starting to crack for these young people. And this is exactly the time that Vonnegut is coming in, and that people are starting to read him. So I think you're right, Olga. There is like this common ground of World War II, but very different ways of interpreting it, and that kind of like makes this break, I would say. But it also allows for dialogue about war, about trauma. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you meant, but we can talk more about it over Skype or email. I'd love to. Let's see. A lot of these I'm going to need to take and think on, and maybe get back to you. I would love to hear from you all. My email is sadphill@iu.edu, sadphill@iu.edu. If you have feedback, comments, questions, I would love to be in dialogue with any of you over email. Oh, Natalia Shulga is here. I'm so glad that you could join. That's really terrific, Natalia. Your interview has been so wonderful and helpful for this project. Okay, Robert Lindsay asks about many English language pieces of literature came to the Russian SSR through Polish translations. Joseph Brodsky was initially only able to encounter Faulkner and Joyce through their Polish translations. Was this Polish detour ever attempted, I guess, for Vonnegut, or were his writings? That's interesting. I do not know the answer to that question, Robert Lindsay. I will be looking that up. I simply don't know. That's a really good question. Yes, Sungurov, Lyosha Gorshkov, hi. And you know Sungurov, he's wonderful, isn't he? I know, I loved the interview with him. Was Vonnegut influenced by the likes of Leirmantov and Pushkin? Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. I'm not a Vonnegut specialist overall. He talked about his favorite Russian writers as being Dostoevsky and Chekhov. I have not seen Vonnegut talk about the influence of Leirmantov or especially Pushkin. I don't know. I haven't seen that. Donald Feeney really, really emphasized Vonnegut's sort of affinities with Dostoevsky and Chekhov. So that's pretty much what I know about that. But I will be looking at. That's a good question. Thank you. Did Kurt Vonnegut know and regard the Strugatsky brothers? I don't know. I don't know if he knew the Strugatsky brothers or not. But many of my interviewees talked about the Strugatsky brothers and reading them at the same time they read Vonnegut. Did he discuss an affiliation with other Soviet sci-fi writers such as Bulgakov? Yes, absolutely. Vonnegut said that he was a huge fan of Master and Margarita. And again, the readers who read Vonnegut, many of them mentioned reading Bulgakov, particularly Margaret and Master and Margarita, which at this time was not easy to get a hold of, was not like sanctioned literature at all. And I should mention that most the people that I interviewed, they talked about sort of the menu of authors that they love to line up beside Bulgakov, beside Vonnegut. Most of them indicated that they did not read dissident literature per se. A few said they did read Chronika Tekushih Событий, Chronicle of Current Events, which was a dissident publication, samizdat publication. But most of them said that they did not, although maybe people in their circle did. And so, yeah, that's the answer to that. Let's see. Yes, so I would say for sure, go and read Vonnegut. You won't be disappointed. Let's see, Natalia Savalova. Natalia, I need to reach out to Ilya Kukulin. Yes, and ask him about New Age influences on the Soviet technical intelligentsia. And yeah, as far as Vonnegut being a sci-fi author, yeah, there's if you look at sort of very early Vonnegut, he was classified as a sci-fi author in the United States. His work was sold, on sci-fi shelves. A lot of that had to do with, topically, Player Piano could be read. It's a dystopian work about a sort of mechanized future where the class of engineers has really, taken over society and has all the power, and this causes lots of inequality. And then Sirens of Titan is, very much in sort of a sci-fi genre or vein. And so I think he was early on classified as sci-fi, was able to quote unquote break out of that eventually, much to his joy. I think Vonnegut was always, sorry that he was considered a sci-fi writer. But the New Age aura, I don't know. That's interesting. Natalia is saying, I wonder if Vonnegut has any New Age aura too, and how he was placed among, if he has any New Age aura. Got to think about that one. Got to think about it. And I need to read what Ilya Kukulin has written on this specifically to be able to talk about more intelligently. Any connection between Vonnegut and the Strugatskys. This is Gardner. Hi, Gardner. Either personal connections or common readership. Common readership, absolutely, in terms of whether Vonnegut knew, I'm sure he knew about the Strugatsky brothers. I've not seen anything about him ever meeting them, being in touch with them, anything like that. And that brings me to another part of my project, and I will definitely close after this. I have likely exhausted your patience, and I appreciate everyone who stuck with me this long in this strange format. But I've tried really hard to figure out what who Vonnegut met when he visited the Soviet Union. He was there for 5 days in October 1974, and then he was there for like 2 or 3 days in the fall of 1977. Both times he went specifically to visit Rita Wright Kovalva, and as far as I can tell, he had a tourist visa. He did not go at the invitation of the Writers Union, which had invited him, mind you, but he wanted his visits to be unofficial official. He wanted to have power over his time, and over the people that he met with. And he really kept his official kind of engagements during those 2 visits to the Soviet Union to a minimum. And there are wonderful letters from Rita to Kurt, and from Rita to other people that talk about those visits, and how wonderful they were, and how he did get to meet the team that was staging the Wanderings of Billy Pilgrim, based on Slaughterhouse 5 at the Soviet Army Theater in Moscow. The idea had been for Vonnegut to come for the premiere of that, but it got delayed, and it didn't happen until the end of 75, beginning of 76. So he missed the premiere of that play at the Soviet Army Theater, but he sent a wonderful telegram that's become very famous, that basically says, please put out a seat for me. I'm with you in spirit. I'll never forget, the Soviet Army, and how they saved my life. And I think it's wonderful that you're staging this play, and I wish I could be there. So that was a really touching telegram that he sent the team, but he was asked to send it. The staging, again, was in danger of being scuttled because of questions were being raised about Vonnegut, and is he a pacifist, and is this appropriate for us to be staging this play? And so Rita Wright basically went on a campaign to get people to write letters, one of them being Semenov, and then she reached out and asked Kurt to send that telegram to the team so that they could show it to the folks that were in the party that were giving them trouble about the play. And so the show did go on, thankfully. Yes, Dmitry Kharitonov, thank you. Yes, that's the book that I was mentioning, by Don Raleigh, Soviet Baby Boomers, an Oral History of Russia's Cold War Generation. Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. I've been tremendously influenced by Don's book. It's been really helpful in thinking through the characteristics of this generation. So wonderful to see all of you. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you for joining in, and yeah, I would love to hear from you and get your feedback. And thanks again to Zach Kelly for putting together this Area Studies lecture series. And please be in touch, and peace.